We're going to still talk about the same key concept that the Europeans had a variety of colonization and migration patterns, but we're going to specifically focus on the British today. In the early 17th century, early British colonies developed along the Atlantic coast, and you can see here in this map. Each of these areas had regional differences that reflected various environmental, economic, cultural, and demographic factors. First, we're going to talk about the Chesapeake and North Carolina colonies. These grew prosperous because of exporting tobacco, which was labor intensive. It was initially cultivated by white, male indentured servants, and later was cultivated by a variety of indentured servants and later enslaved Africans. So the Chesapeake colonies include Virginia, Maryland, and their economy was based on tobacco or cash crop agriculture. They exported tobacco to England, France, Holland, the Caribbean, and South America. And these colonies used plantation economies to get this cheap labor that they needed to cultivate tobacco and later other cash crops. Indentured servitude was used to establish a very cheap labor source in the Chesapeake colonies. Many poor and imprisoned British citizens wanted to go to the colonies to either get out of prison or start a new life, but they needed someone to pay for their passage across the Atlantic Ocean. Since cheap labor in the colonies was needed, and Native American laborers who originally were enslaved escaped or died, indentured servants would agree to work 4 to 7 years in return for passage, board, food, and clothing once they reached the New World. The life for these indentured servants was harsh and restrictive, but it was not slavery because they could have the possibility of being freed. The term of indentured servitude could be extended. If you ran away, broke a law, or if you were a female and you got pregnant, your term could actually be extended for life. However, after a while, a racial hierarchy was needed to ensure that people who had power in these Chesapeake colonies kept power. And so in 1619, Africans came to Jamestown, and they were originally treated as indentured servants because there were no slave laws. They had the same opportunities for freedom and dues as whites. But by 1641 and 1661 in Massachusetts and Virginia, respectively, slave laws began to be passed, and a racial hierarchy begins. White indentured servitude went away, and slavery for these former Africans, now migrants to the New World, began. The New England colonies were originally settled by Puritans. They developed small towns with family farms, and they had a mixed economy of both agriculture and commerce. So the Puritans came to the New World in the Massachusetts area. They had town meetings. They practiced direct democracy, where almost the whole community gathered to make and approve laws or budgets. They practiced a hard work ethic. They believed that hard work, discipline, and frugality were the result of a person's subscription to the values of the Protestant faith. They also had an increased life expectancy in New England. It was longer than in Britain and the South, in the southern colonies. They also had something called blue laws. These blue laws in the Puritan community enforced proper behavior in public. For example, my favorite is you weren't allowed to kiss in public. They practiced subsistence farming, meaning you farm what you need. Generally, small family farms, no cash crops, so you grow what your family can eat, and that's about it. They did have a social hierarchy, and the church leaders were the top of the community, and if you were enslaved, you were, of course, the bottom of the community, and everyone else was in between. And they established our first university, Harvard College. In 1636, it was established to train Protestant ministers or Puritan ministers. The Puritan religion was something that they believed would set an example for the rest of the world. John Winthrop, the leader of this Puritan community in New England, wrote a text called City on a Hill. He believed that the Puritans were there to be an example to the rest of the world. He writes that all eyes are upon us. In 1892, this etching that you see down here of the Salem witch trials was created, and it depicts an event from 1692. Young girls claimed to be possessed by the devil. They accused local women in the Puritan community of witchcraft. A special court, which we'll talk about later, was set up in Massachusetts, and a woman named Bridget Bishop was actually convicted of witchcraft and hung, along with 18 others. 150 men, women, and children were accused of witchcraft and later locked up, and this created mass hysteria. This is a bitter legacy of the Puritan, strict social, political, and religious structure. The Massachusetts general courts later apologized for their actions of convicting people falsely of witchcraft. We also have a very famous trial of Anne Hutchinson. She was a midwife and religious leader, and she spoke out against the church following Puritan pastor John Cotton's teachings, and she was accused of heresy because she was a female questioning the male church elders. She was actually banished from the Puritan community, and that's an example that a lot of people followed in her footsteps. If you disagreed with the leaders of the church, you were banished because she believed she had a personal relationship with God. Roger Williams was another man who disagreed with church practices. He believed that he heard from God himself. He believed in religious freedom and tolerance, and he disagreed with the practice of confiscating land from Native Americans. And so the Puritan church, again, kicked him out. Roger Williams, however, started a new colony called Rhode Island. The Middle Colonies had a flourishing export economy. They grew cereal crops, and they had a wide range of migrants from different parts of Europe that led to societies with more cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity and tolerance than the New England or the Chesapeake or Southern colonies. The Quakers, William Penn, and religious tolerance are all words that need to go together in your head. The Society of Friends, or the Quakers, it was a group of religious believers who refused to bow to the crown and therefore were not welcomed in England. They were Christians. They believed everyone had a right to seek God in his or her own way, so they believed in religious tolerance. William Penn created Pennsylvania for this reason. This became a colony of tolerance. William Penn's dad was very close to the King of England, and so William Penn, the son, was given land to form a colony for these dissenters, these Quakers. The Pennsylvania Quakers had a good relationship with Native Americans. Women had more freedom in this colony, and women could participate in Quaker meetings. They did not have a tax-supported church. The Quakers had a strong government. The Pennsylvania economy was focused on trade and shipping, especially through Pennsylvania, which was known as the City of Brotherly Love. New Jersey was also a Quaker society before Penn came to the colonies. That's about all you'll ever learn about New Jersey in terms of colonial establishments. And then for ethnic diversity, the middle colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And in these colonies, we see a wide variety of Europeans move there. English, Swedes, Dutch, Scotch, Irish, and French all live in close proximity to one another, more so than in any location even in continental Europe. The middle colonies were known as the breadbasket colonies because they had extremely fertile soil, especially Pennsylvania, and they grew wheat and other cereal crops. On average, people in the middle colonies ate about 1 pound of bread a day. The mills in this area were powered by rivers, and some of the most common foods in the middle colonies were pretzels, pancakes, and waffles. The colonies of the southernmost part of the Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies that were based on growing staple crops or cash crops. These colonies depend on the labor of enslaved Africans, who oftentimes made up the majority of the population in these areas, and these groups of people actually developed their own cultural and religious autonomy. So some of the things that were grown in the southern colonies were cash crops like rice and sugar. Rice was very difficult to grow, but many South Carolina planters found that African slaves could successfully grow the crop, and they had to rely on them to actually grow rice. There was more independence if you were enslaved in growing rice in South Carolina than in other colonies. For example, sugar was another labor-intensive crop. The Spanish used the encomienda system and Native Americans and enslaved Africans later in the Caribbean to cultivate sugar. And the English, who did settle in the West Indies, they used the same type of system. Because there was more, I don't want to say independence amongst people who were enslaved in the South, but there was a larger population of people in the South who were enslaved, and they did actually create unique and successful cultures. So we see some positive and some negative things grow from this. Here's a negative thing. A lot of Southern colonies create slave codes. These were state laws or colony laws. They restricted the already few freedoms of slaves. They were meant to curb slave revolts or rebellions. Slave codes included things like you can't buy guns, you can't travel without permission from your owner, you can't get married. It gave slave owners absolute power over slaves. But here's a bit of culture that develops because there was such a high population, especially in places like South Carolina. Descendants of enslaved Africans who lived in South Carolina and Georgia on the coast and the Sea Islands created or practiced a culture called Gullah. Gullah is also the name of a Creole language spoken by this group. This Gullah society was a small farming and fishing society, a very tight-knit community. They had a unique heritage and culture, and they created African-style handicrafts like baskets. And this culture is still preserved if you go to this area of the United States. Other things that come from this strong society that develops in the Southern colonies are spirituals. These are songs created by Black Christians in the United States. It began in the colonies. Spirituals were sung or taught through oral tradition, and they combined European Christian hymns with African musical elements and were sung by Black slaves. Now, we do see distance and Britain's initial attention growing lax, and the colonies begin to self-govern themselves. The colonies were unusually democratic for the area. The New England colonies based their power in participatory town meetings. They elected their own colonial legislators. In the Southern colonies, the elite planters actually controlled the government and dominated elected assemblies. So, the Mayflower Compact was signed in 1620. It was signed by the Pilgrims as the ship reached Plymouth, so before the ship actually landed. And this created our first direct democracy of the English in the colonies. All men, according to the Mayflower Compact, could vote on new laws in the budget. Sorry, women. The House of Burgesses was the first representative democracy in the British colonies. In 1619, an elected legislative assembly in the Virginia colony was created through this document, and this is actually the building where they met. Again, this is the first representative democracy, and that's where you have people who you elect to represent you create your laws and budget. And then finally, we have a New England example called the Massachusetts General Court, coming back to this from talking about the Puritans. In the Puritan community, John Winthrop thought it was necessary for a governing body to make decisions without the consent of the governed. So a small group of local shareholders all held government power. These were mostly high-up church members. However, later, this Massachusetts General Court opens up to freemen to participate in lawmaking. A spirit of community develops despite its foundation as an authoritarian style of leadership. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.